Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt playing Elton John today. Did his farewell concert last night in England. I got to tell you, Governor Chris Christie is a Bruce Springsteen fan. I don't know that he likes Elton John much. Good morning, Governor. What do you say about that?
Love Elton John.
All right, just checking.
Went to see him on the farewell Yellow Brick Road tour. Great show.
Governor, I just had on Vivek Ramaswamy, and he has a question for you. He says that you say we've got to stop looking backwards and being angry about the past. He asked, does that apply 360 to all Republicans, including Donald Trump?
I don't even understand his question. The bottom line is that we can't have a candidate who only looks backwards. And so Vivek, as usual, misunderstands my point and just tries to make it for his own advantage. So
Vivek also told me that he would pardon Julian Assange, Ross Ulbricht, and Edward Snowden. What do you think about that?
Look, I unlike Vivek, I've actually had the pardon power, and I take it very seriously. And I would have to look at every one of those cases individually before making a decision if they made an application. But, again, this is the kind of immature stuff that we get from him, just throwing red meat out there to try to get attention. And so, I don't want to waste the time I have with you on an interview talking about this kind of stuff.
All right. Let me ask you my question now. Josh Kraushaar said last hour that you, Chris Christie, are consolidating the anti-Trump vote in New Hampshire. You've moved up to third place. He expects you're going to continue to move. Is that the practical strategy of the Christie campaign?
The strategy of the Christie campaign is to win every voter I can out there. It's not for any one particular group of voters who are predisposed in one way or the other. Because quite frankly, I think the truth is universal, Hugh. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't respect the truth, doesn't want to be told the truth, and doesn't want to hear the truth. And so this campaign is for the people who think that the truth matters. And I think that's going to be a very, very large number of Republican voters all across this country. Remember, Hugh, we have not even been in this race for 3 weeks, and we're already in third place in New Hampshire, only 4 points behind Ron DeSantis. We've moved up to fourth place in the national NBC poll that came out last week, and it came out yesterday, rather, and we haven't even been in this race for 3 weeks. So,
are you going to make the 40,000 donations, Governor?
Yes, sir.
And what do you want the format of the first two debates are in August and September, and others will follow. What do you want the format to be?
Look, I'd like it to be as free-flowing as it can be so that the candidates get to interact with each other and that it's not a glorified press conference. But guess what, Hugh? No matter what the format is, I'll show up and I'll make my points.
I'm sure you will. Now I want to borrow your prosecutorial experience. If Jack Smith, special counsel, brings another set of charges related to January 6th against Donald Trump, will that complicate the first set of charges? Will they have to be brought in Miami? And what do you think about bifurcating his investigation?
Well, look, I don't have any problem with a bifurcation of an investigation, especially if you don't think that the conduct that's potentially criminal hasn't occurred in the same jurisdiction. And so if, in fact, he's decided to bring the first case in Miami, which I think was the appropriate jurisdictional decision, I don't know how you could bring that case appropriately if there's a January 6th case in Miami. I don't know all the facts, but it doesn't seem like it makes sense. And so I think bifurcating it, if for no other reason from a jurisdictional perspective, probably made sense because it avoids all those jurisdictional motions that would come from the defense that would further delay any potential resolution.
Governor, do you think that Jack Smith is really thinking this through about timing of trials? If he brings a second indictment in a different jurisdiction, isn't a lot of America going to think he's Javert of some sort?
Look, again, I think the way we should make these judgments, Hugh, is based upon what are the underlying facts. If there are facts that are beyond a reasonable doubt that crimes were committed by whoever he's looking at in the January 6th matter, including Donald Trump, then I think he's got a decision to make about whether or not he needs to execute prosecutorial discretion. But in the end, that's a decision every prosecutor has to make in our system about every case. In the end, I don't think that we fix our justice system by continuing misdeeds. And what I mean by that is there's no doubt in my mind that Loretta Lynch and Jim Comey were wrong in not prosecuting Hillary Clinton. I don't think the way you fix the justice system is then to say anybody in a similar circumstance going forward gets a pass. I just don't think that's the way you fix the system, by relying upon precedent from people who were so obviously wrong.
So, Governor, what do you think in terms of Hunter Biden and the Department of Justice's explanations here and the whistleblowers that Jason Smith brought before the Ways and Means Committee last week?
Unfortunately, I think there's a lot to look at here, Hugh. First off, it's stunning to me that it took 5 years for a Republican U.S. attorney in Delaware, appointed by Donald Trump, to negotiate a 2-count misdemeanor tax plea and to go to a diversion on the gun crime. If that were the case, that should have been done much, much more quickly. And if I'd been running that office and someone took more than a year to get that squared away, that's a gross failure by the office. And I think that the U.S. Attorney in Delaware has a lot of questions to answer in light of what the whistleblowers have said, but also, Hugh, just in light of how long it's taken to come to this conclusion. I'm not trying to imply that the guy did something unethical, but I don't know what the explanation for it is, and we need to have one.
Governor, a lot of people forget you were a U.S. attorney yourself. Do you think that U.S. Attorney Weiss ought to appear in front of the House Judiciary Committee, the Oversight Committee, and answer questions? Is that inappropriate given his job, or is that appropriate given his job?
Look, I think it depends on what posture he says the investigation is in. And I think he should only answer questions regarding the part of the investigation that's over. Now, look, you have to count on somebody's integrity in this, Hugh, because a prosecutor can say an investigation is ongoing forever. And so I think that Mr. Weiss has an obligation, given all the information that's out there, to answer questions from Congress. And I think if he can't, he said, because he says there's an ongoing investigation, that he has to set a time frame for when that investigation will be finished.
Good point.
It can't be January of 2025.
Now, Governor, based on what you see, do you believe either the president or Attorney General Merrick Garland are infirm? Because neither of them strike me as in particular command of their jobs.
I certainly think the president is showing and has shown over the course of his entire time in office not being up to the job, not being capable or competent to do aspects of the job. The Attorney General has been so invisible, Hugh, that it's hard for me to really make a fair evaluation, except to say that I think he made a gross error this week in defending broadly the Department of Justice in their conduct of these investigations. Does he really want to warranty the work of Loretta Lynch and Jim Comey? I wouldn't. And I don't think he necessarily wants to warranty the work of Mr. Weiss if, in fact, he's had no involvement in it. So, look, his judgment is questioned by me, no doubt, but he's been such an invisible AG. From my perspective, Hugh, it's hard for me to judge him the way we can judge the president from a physical infirmity perspective.
Let me ask you about the attack underway on the Supreme Court. And it is relentless. It's on Justice Alito, on Justice Thomas, on the idea of expanding the court. We have two big decisions this week, Creative 303 and the Harvard case. One will strike a blow for religious freedom, the other for a race-neutral world. What do you think will happen in those two cases? And what do you think is going on with the dark money attack from the left on the court?
I think your read on both those cases is correct as to what the most likely outcome is to be. And I think, look, the great news is I don't know Justice Thomas well. I've met him a couple of times. I know Sam Alito very well. He was one of my predecessors as U.S. Attorney in New Jersey and was on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals when I became U.S. Attorney and was a regular advisor to me in terms of talking about what his experience running the office was and giving me advice when I asked it on issues of managing the office. Sam Alito will be completely immune to these baseless attacks. I think he is the intellectual center of the court now. I think he has inherited the Scalia mantle, and I think he is unmoved by these type of crass attacks on him. He's got a wonderful wife who is tough and strong and supports him. And I think that Sam Alito will be absolutely unaffected by this, and that's for the benefit of the country, but also who he is in his heart and in his soul.
Tell me something, Governor. What is going on? Do you think they're trying to prepare to pack the court by virtue of the baseless, endless attacks on justices?
Of course they are. And that's why it's so important, Hugh, that we have somebody at the top of the ticket in 2024 who will not only win the presidency, but has shown an ability to be able to lead so that we have a Republican Senate along with maintaining our Republican House. And then the Democrats have no hope of being able to change the law to pack the court. But if we nominate Donald Trump, Hugh, we will have Joe Biden, a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, and then Katie bar the door, because they will do in the 2 years that they'll have, because they'll so ruin the country, we'll kick them out in 2026. But in the 2 years they have, they will do so much damage that it is unthinkable to folks like you and I. And Donald Trump has proven himself to be a three-time loser. He hasn't won a thing for this party since he got elected in 2016. He lost the House in 2018, the White House and the Senate in 2020, and he lost two more governorships, another Senate seat, and led us to a bare win in the House of Representatives, and we had a president who was in the mid-30s of popularity. He is a three-time loser, and I cannot understand why our party wants to be led by a three-time loser who cares only about himself and not the party or the country. And his speech to faith and freedom this weekend just proved it again.
So, Governor, talk to me a little bit about the trial of Donald Trump. Have you got a guess on the trial date? Are you worried about interlocutory appeals? And do you think Judge Cannon is an appropriate judge to hear this case?
I don't know Judge Cannon well, but I'm going to assume that anyone who has been confirmed by the United States Senate and is a lifetime tenured federal judge will take this case with the seriousness that it deserves and will do a good job. I know she's not been on the bench long, and so this is a obviously historic case for someone of that tenure to take. But I know how these things get assigned, Hugh. It's called the wheel, and whoever's up next, the clerk does not show favor or fear, and whoever's next up on the wheel is the person who gets the case. So I have to assume that's the way Judge Cannon got it. In terms of trial date, I don't fear interlocutory appeal nearly as much as I do some of the concerns about the classified documents and what you're going to have to go through to be able to qualify as counsel to see those documents and clear them with a background check, and whatever the declassification process might be, if it needs to be able to show these documents to a jury. That's the part of it that concerns me the most. And that's why, Hugh, if I were the U.S. attorney prosecuting this case, I think, and I don't know all the facts, but I think I may have just charged the obstruction case and the lying to federal agents case rather than the each document case in order to try to get justice to be as swift as it possibly could.
Well, it seems to me that if CIPA, Classified Information Protection Act, presents problems, they'll narrow it down to the least damaging document that should have been turned over and those other counts and get moving, which brings me to my question. If you were Donald Trump's lawyers, would you advise him to take part in debates?
Sure, I would. Because I've already given a two-part interview to Brett Baer. What the hell is the difference?
Well, because people might follow up more on I think he kind of admitted the obstruction charge, didn't he?
He didn't kind of admit the obstruction charge. He did admit the obstruction charge. Look, what Donald Trump's lawyers were doing during that Brett Baer interview was opening the nearest window and jumping out, because The obstruction case is done. It is done as far as I'm concerned, based upon his own words on that interview with Bret Baier. Not to mention that he's taking credit, as an aside, for pardoning Alice Johnson while at the same time saying that if he were president again, he'd have her subjected to the death penalty. And when confronted with that, he looked like a confused old man. Not understanding
there is an answer
about.
to that, but I don't know that trying to get that out on a debate stage will be particularly effective. So if he skips the debate, should the RNC go forward with him?
Well, of course, Hugh. I mean, look, why don't we all just drop out and give him the nomination? I mean, that conversation is ridiculous. Of course we should go ahead with the debate because he is a flawed man. And Bill Barr said it best. This campaign cannot be a national therapy session for a flawed and disturbed man. And
all right, let me switch to presidential issues.
So, Hugh, don't interrupt me on that answer. In that Bret Baier interview, it was disturbing to hear some of the answers he gave and how detached from reality they were, including saying he's going to persuade suburban women to vote for him in 2024 by insisting to them he already won in 2020. Republicans need to listen to those answers because they will only get worse, not better, between now and November of 24.
All right. I don't want to interrupt Chris, but I do want to get to some substantive things that do not involve politics, most of all being the events in Russia this weekend. What did you make of that? And what do you make of our intelligence agencies leaking that we knew it was coming? I can't believe our intelligence agencies leaked that.
I was stunned to see that, Hugh. And I think, once again, it's another unforced error by the Biden administration. They're trying to show that they're actually on top of things because they have this incredible inferiority complex because they know the guy at the top isn't up to the job. So they want to make sure that they let people know, oh, don't worry, we were on top of it, even though the guy at the top of the ticket here doesn't look like he's totally with it. I think it was wrong decision. As far as the substance of Russia, look, I think this is a big problem for Putin. You know that. Whenever a dictator has to cut a deal with someone in order to get them to turn around, and I am sure that there was a large payment of money that went along with a ticket to Belarus for the Wagner Group. It seems to me that shows that what we're doing in Ukraine is the right thing because it is the argument inside Russia over the prosecution of the war that is leading to the weakness of Putin that only happens with American and NATO support of Ukraine and the fight that they're putting to the Russians. And so for people like Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, who basically want to give away Ukraine to the Russians because in Trump's case, that's what he does because he's a Putin sympathizer. And in DeSantis's case, it's a total misunderstanding of the stakes here and the proxy war that this represents with China. This is all, very interesting developments and supportive of the path that we're taking as a country and should continue to take, in my view, to support Ukraine with the weaponry they need to fight the Russians.
Now, Governor, I've got a column in the Post today arguing that China should be the number one issue in the GOP campaign because they are our existential threat. Do you agree with that? And what did you think of Blinken's trip to China last week?
I do think that China is the single most important international issue that we have to confront, and it infects everything that we're talking about, whether it's Ukraine, whether it is other relations in Europe, whether it's Asia, India, and everything in the Asian theater that is going to be hugely important to the United States going forward for trade and for strategic decisions. And Boykin's trip was an embarrassment, not only because Boykin looked weak, but also because then he comes home and Biden calls, if you're going to take that approach, then Biden calls the guy a dictator within 12 hours of him returning, and they look like the gang who couldn't shoot straight. Let's pick an approach and use it so that we don't look weak and incompetent. They looked weak and incompetent off the China trip.
Governor, I want to talk about the Uyghurs. It seems to me that the silence during the Blinken trip of the Uyghurs is like the silence about the Jews in the 30s in Germany. And I am astonished that the American foreign policy establishment talks about China without mentioning the Uyghurs. Will they be part of your rhetoric on the campaign trail? Because it is a genocide and people aren't talking about it.
They absolutely will be, Hugh. And let me say this. That's been a large conversation inside our family. I have a son who just graduated from Providence College and did some study while he was in college on the Uyghurs. And he forces that conversation regularly, our son Patrick, inside this house, because he, as a 22-year-old, is so appalled by the Chinese conduct. Well, if a 22-year-old recent graduate of college understands how important this is, someone running for president of the United States should as well. And genocide anywhere in this world is unacceptable to free, God-fearing people. And what the Chinese are doing is disgusting.
All right, two more questions, Governor. I'll let you go. Three, actually. New York Times yesterday had a headline, ahead of New York Pride Parade, worries about LGBTQ rights. I actually don't see any threats to LGBTQ rights. I see an attempt to protect children. What is going on with this? LGBT people are under assault.
I don't see it either, Hugh. And I think that this country, as it almost always turns out to place the rights of all of our citizens in a place where they can be protected, and as long as they're being reasonable. And I think that I don't see it. I think there's been enormous respect given to people in the LGBTQ community, and I don't see what they see. But that's not unusual for the front page of the New York Times to continue to try to create a crisis in that regard. And I don't see it.
Is there a conflation between the issues surrounding children suffering from gender dysphoria and LGBTQ rights? Because I think they're conflating the issues, and they ought not to be conflated.
Well, of course they are, Hugh. And look, and I talked about this last week. I am always concerned about the government getting involved and getting in between parents and their children. And the fact is, if this, we've been talking about education for a lot in the last year or two, and about the fact that parents need to be in the middle of their children's education, and that these choices, when Terry McAuliffe started this whole major national discussion by saying parents had no business being involved in what their children are being taught in the classroom. That, along with the horrible decisions made during COVID regarding how our children would be educated, put forward the very, I think, appropriate discussion about how parents need to be respected and their rights need to be respected on raising their children the way they see fit. I think that applies to this issue as well. And I would not substitute government's judgment in place of any parent's judgment on these issues. That, to me, is the conservative position on this, Hugh. And I think it's wrong for folks to try to inject the government into the middle of it. We need to respect parents' rights in all respects.
Penultimate question, Governor. Matthew McConaughey released a video yesterday. You might put him on your short list for vice president, extolling grants to make school campuses safer. Do you believe in armed police at every campus?
I believe in each campus making a judgment as to how to make their campus safer, right? So I think there are technologies that exist out there right now, Hugh, that can lock down schools and that can make them significantly safer. I have no opposition, though, to a school making the decision that that they need an armed guard in their school. If they believe that's what best protects the children, our priority should be protecting our children from harm when they go to school. And that's why, again, a real conservative thinks these decisions don't need to be made at the federal government, don't need to be made at the state government. They need to be made at the local school board level with the support, appropriate financial support, I think, not only from the local taxpayers, but from state government.
Last question, then there's a statement, Governor. Would you welcome federal legislation on abortion, federal legislation, and if so, of what sort?
Hugh, what I want is what we've been asking for 50 years, which is to return this matter to the states and to let each state and its people make a judgment on this issue. Then and only then if a national consensus is formed based upon what's happened in the 50 states as led by their people, then I would have no problem with the federal government coming in and codifying a national consensus that would need 60 votes in the United States Senate. And so I don't think you can get 60 votes in the Senate until you've gone through the exercise of each state and its people having their say on this issue. I obviously would be out there advocating for a pro-life position with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. But Hugh, I believe we've been fighting for this for 50 years. I love our federalist system, and let's let the states and the people decide this issue before the federal government tries to come in and Bigfoot it. Because quite frankly, I don't think there is a theory right now that could get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate.
Great answer, Governor. I want to conclude with I don't ever talk to the governor without mentioning Frankie Linder is batting .222 and Andres Jimenez is batting .242, and the Guardians and the Mets have the same loss number. What do you think about the trade, Governor?
I still think the trade line. I love Lindor, and I think he's, this is a guy who posts up, as you know, every day. This guy literally has played, I think he has missed 2 games in the last 2 years. He is a gamer. He's a fighter. And I love Lindor. But it's a bad day to ask you that, Hugh. After the horrific loss we suffered yesterday in Philadelphia, I am in a Mets funk today.
Well, so am I. Guardians blew one yesterday, too. But so you've got 42 losses. The Guardians only have 41. So I just say, a president has to admit their mistakes, Governor. And I keep looking at this Lindor-Jimenez trade and thinking, you gotta look back and just say, I wouldn't do that again.
You know what, Hugh? I don't think it's a mistake because the Mets needed a leader on that field. And I don't think Andres Jimenez, as good a player as he is, could have been a leader on that field. Lindor is a leader in that locker room. And even though it's not showing in the win-loss record right now, it did last year when we won 101 games. And I think that Francisco Lindor is the type of personality and player you want on your roster. And the Mets needed one of those at the time they made the trade. So, look, with both our teams playing the way they are, we got more to complain about than the Lindor-Jimenez trade. That's for sure.
Governor, always good to talk to you. Keep coming back. I appreciate a half hour of your time in a busy schedule. Thank you, Governor.
Hugh, thanks for having me on. It's always great talking to you.
All right. Be well. Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Greetings. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside of Studio North, and it's a great hour coming up. Christie at the bottom of the hour for a half hour. I begin, though, with Vivek Ramaswamy. He is, of course, running for the presidency. Good morning, Vivek. Welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Morning, Hugh. How are you?
I'm good, but Amul Thabar tells me you're a Bengals fan, so I didn't know that. And that actually makes you not from Ohio. That makes you from Kentucky. Are you a season ticket holder for the Bengals?
I was born and raised in Cincinnati and used to go there, but I live in Columbus, Ohio now. So I'm an Ohio State football season ticket holder, but not a Bengals one anymore.
Okay, it's perfectly legitimate to invite journalists to sit with you at the shoe. I'm just telling you that up front. Vivek, last hour, Josh Kraushaar and I were talking about you behind your back. And Josh said he interviewed you for Jewish Insider last week, and that you are, quote, the most anti-Ukraine, close quote, of all the Republican candidates. What do you think of that description, and do you like it?
I wouldn't call myself anti-Ukraine. I'm all for Ukraine pursuing a Ukraine-first agenda and Poland pursuing a Poland-first agenda. But I probably am the most America first of the candidates when it comes to our foreign policy, including as it relates to Ukraine. I do have a clear vision of how to end the Ukraine war on terms that don't just save the U.S. money. I think that's the superficial stance for pulling out of Ukraine, but actually advancing American interests by doing a deal that I think has a very good chance of being our last best chance to pull Putin apart from Xi Jinping and dissolve the Sino-Russian military alliance. So that's, of course, a much deeper discussion, but to me, that's not anti-Ukraine, that's pro-America.
Would you cut off military aid to Ukraine in the course of setting that up? Or are you one of those I can solve it in 24 to 48 hour guys like former President Trump?
I would give myself 72 hours to sit in a room effectively with Vladimir Putin and the other parties at the table and negotiate a deal. The basic terms of the deal, and of course we would get the best deal we can, but the basic gist is no further aid to Ukraine, permanent commitment by NATO not to admit Ukraine, that the U.S. would backstop. But in return, Putin exits his 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Cooperation with China and the 2022 No Limits Partnership, moves all nuclear weapons out of Kaliningrad, the region that borders Poland, and also removes any Russian military presence from the Western Hemisphere, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and so on. And I think that that restores a trilateral international order instead of the bilateral one that we now have that favors China. It also, I would restore normal economic relations with Russia. Putin does not relish being Xi Jinping's little brother in that relationship. And so in a certain way, Hugh, it's the reverse of what Nixon did in 1972 with Mao. We did not have trust for Mao Zedong then, just as we should not have trust for Putin now. But we can trust each of them to follow their self-interest. Mao was Brezhnev's little brother. Nixon pulled him out of that relationship. Putin's like the new Mao. I think we can actually pull them out of their partnership with China. And I think that the Sino-Russian military alliance is the single greatest military threat and foreign policy threat that the United States faces today. And this is also how we deter war with Taiwan, with China in the context of Taiwan. Because Xi Jinping's bet, effectively, is that with Russia in his back, that's the largest nuclear stockpile in the world, super EMP capabilities, hypersonic missile capabilities. He says with that military alliance with China, Xi Jinping's bet is that the U.S. won't want to go to war with two different allied nuclear superpowers at the same time. But if Russia's not
Vivek,
China's
is it
then
realistic?
I think she has to think twice.
Is it realistic for you or President Trump to say 24 hours, 72 hours? These things take a long time. Nixon's visit to China, as you may or may not know, took months to set up, much less years to execute its vision. Why the 72-hour talk? It just doesn't work that way.
Well, I think the 72 hours is, I think, not a hard deadline compared to what we actually need to deliver. But I think that the terms of the deal that I'm coming in with are pretty clear. And I have a high degree of confidence, Hugh, and this is maybe what bucks the consensus, that Putin would see it as being in his self-interest to actually go after it. If the West restores normal economic relations with Russia, he has less of a relationship and less of a reason to be in that relationship with Xi Jinping. He also does not enjoy being that little brother in the relationship. I think we're working within a window where we can actually get that deal done. Even after that so-called no limits partnership was signed, Putin still sent a signal by actually sending weapons both to India and to Vietnam, both of whom share a border with China. Northeast China is still closed to the ocean because Putin's blocking the way, preventing them from laying the rails and building a railroad. So I think there are now cracks in that armor, kinks in that armor. This is our moment to actually pull Russia apart from China. But China's coming to Russia's aid in the context of Ukraine precisely because of their no limits partnership. So I would end the war in Ukraine. I would do it promptly.
What did you make of Secretary Blinken's trip to Beijing last week?
Weak. Fundamental weakness. I mean, I think it was embarrassing for the United States to see the level of sliding that we experienced. And this is part of a broader pattern we've seen over the last year and a half of China slowly testing the United States. A Chinese spy balloon that flew over half the United States. If that were a Russian spy balloon, no doubt we would have shot it down instantly and ratcheted up sanctions on Russia. The reason we didn't do it for the Chinese spy balloon is that we're dependent on China for our modern way of life. Biden then referred to that as a silly balloon. Well, guess what? We now learn that a silly spy base is popping up in Cuba. Silly incidents of aggression in the South China Sea. Well, I think that this is no longer silly anymore. Blinken is behaving like he's supplicating, like much of the modern West commercially supplicates to China. And I think the fundamental reason why is that we don't have the spine to take any risk when it comes to the economic reliance on China. So this is where
Vivek,
I'm different than Trump, Hugh. Yep.
What do you make of the Uyghurs? And should they be in every sentence that every candidate talks about China?
I think they should. I think that this is one of the great human rights atrocities of our time. I think arguably the greatest human rights atrocity committed by a major nation since the Third Reich of Germany. And I don't say that lightly. Here you have 1 million religious minorities enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse, as reported by Adrian Zenz, a great German journalist who did this work a couple of years ago. I'll tell you this. We, on one hand, talk about fighting for democracy selectively, yet one of our largest trade partners with whom we're in a supplicating relationship is committing the largest scale human rights atrocities, that juxtaposition can't go unnoticed. And so I'm not just saying this because I'm standing up for the Uyghurs. I'm saying it because it's evidence of what this CCP that's in control actually represents. This is the true threat that we face. We have to open our eyes up and see it and act accordingly, to think on the timescales of history instead of quarterly earnings reports, to actually declare economic independence from China. And Hugh, I think I'm the only candidate that has an actual clear vision of how to accomplish that in a way that does not incur great economic damage here in the United States. But that's what we're going to have to muster up the courage to do, and I'm running to deliver it.
I don't know if you saw Axios this morning, Vivek Ramaswamy, but Larry Fink is backing away from ESG. He's apologizing for his involvement in ESG. He says he wants conscientious capitalism. What do you make of his about face, and do you believe him?
Well, conscientious capitalism is the new ESG. They tried to change last year their ESG funds to use the word sustainability instead. So they're very good at changing acronyms. But the reason I don't believe him is that I know they're going to be unable to do it. Here's why. CalPERS, New York pension funds, et cetera, they have required financial institutions like BlackRock to enter arrangements, including most asset managers that have signed, BlackRock included, the Climate Action 100 Plus network. That's a $68 trillion plus represented network of asset managers signing on to an institution founded by CalPERS, one of the largest pension funds in the US and the world, that requires adopting certain commitments as a condition for managing that state-sponsored money. Those are what pension funds are. So the reason what's really happening here is it's not the invisible hand of the free market that gives you ESG. It's the invisible fist of the government lurking behind the scene, saying you don't get to manage government money, such as state pension fund money, unless you adopt those commitments. So they'll change the name, as I predicted in my book.
Would you be willing to debate Larry Fink if he would agree?
Absolutely. I have a policy, Hugh. I have a talk to everyone policy. I'm running to lead a nation. You can't hide from debate. To the contrary, I'll take him up on that debate if he's willing to do it.
Vivek, our alma mater has a Supreme Court decision coming down this week, the affirmative action case involving Harvard. Do you, as I, hope that they lose and lose badly, and that all reference to race is forbidden and actionable in any college situation as a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Absolutely. 100%. That is the outcome that I optimistically expect and certainly hope for. And Hugh, I hope that's just a first step to really eviscerating race-based preferences and quota systems in every sphere of American life. I've said as U.S. president, I would rescind Executive Order 11246, signed by Lyndon Johnson, that created similar race-based preferences in the economy. For anybody who's doing business with the federal government, that constitutes 20% of the U.S. workforce covered by it. I'd say that I would rescind that executive order so that we can restore meritocracy across the American economy. And I'm glad that's going to start, I hope, with college admissions, with the pending Supreme Court case that we're expecting to hear. Harvard should lose for good reason and restore merit again.
I agree. Vivek, I was doing research to prepare for the interview today, and I saw someone on Twitter saying you are the only candidate for president to openly state that he would free Ross Ulbricht, Edward Snowden, and Julian Assange. I have not seen you say that. Is that a correct statement of your views?
Yeah, my wall's falling out behind me, so don't mind that. Yes, it is. It is a correct statement from my vantage point. I think that Julian Assange, let's start with I think he's the easiest of the cases. He was actually somebody who was punished for publishing information leaked by government officials, including Chelsea Manning, who had her sentence commuted by President Obama because she's a member of a favored political class. She's trans. I don't believe in two standards of justice. I really don't, Hugh. I think that we have one standard of justice for all Americans. Much of what the DC press corps does on a given day involves printing leaked information from government officials and whistleblowers. Yet Julian Assange was a member of a disfavored political class at the time. That's why he was ultimately punished. So now I think we do have two standards of justice in the country. One of the things I'm going to do as U.S. president is to fix that, to address it by actually applying the same standard of justice regardless of your political persuasion. Not one for Antifa and conservatives who are labeled domestic terrorists if they show up at school board meetings. Not one for Trump, not one for Biden, not one for Julian Assange, not one for Chelsea Manning. That's
All
what
right,
I stand for, and that's not a Republican or Democrat issue.
It's an interview, not a debate. I want to remind my audience that. Ross Ulbricht, tell us about your position on Ross Ulbricht.
Yeah, so look, I've studied up on his case. I think I met his mother twice, actually. The first time I met his mother was months ago. She actually invigorated my interest in getting into the details on this. He's a guy who has served, or will have served, certainly by October of this year, over 10 years in prison. I think it is an unfair standard that we use for him for running a platform when much of Silicon Valley, Snapchat, let's just take that as an example, much of the fentanyl that youth access across this country come from actually fentanyl poisoning through Percocet and other drugs that are illegally sold via Snapchat, the platform. That doesn't mean that Evan Spiegel or somebody else who's the executive at Snapchat is a drug dealer, but it does mean that the platform that's being used is something that we have to examine as a society for how we're looking at how kids, in this case, are purchasing drugs or fentanyl. Well, I think that Ross Ulbricht, I think there was a lot in that case that smelled rotten to me, including the initial supposed allegations of murder for hire, but which the government didn't actually charge in the end. I think it reeks of a certain kind of selective prosecution, which is the number one thing that I care about restoring justice around, Hugh, is I do not believe in selective prosecution for certain classes over others while leaving others protected. The guy has served 10 years. No doubt if he had done a plea deal, and there have been conflicting media reports on this as to whether or not he was offered one, 10 years would have been about what he would have served. I think that that's sufficient for applying a dual standard of justice. No, I think that he also deserves a commutation of sentence. In that case, it wouldn't be a pardon, but it would be commuting his sentence.
Edward Snowden.
Yes, so this is a tough case. But where I come down is, look, I think that once we have learned the level of corruption that our government actually has engaged in repeatedly lying to the public, in a certain form, it's a form of selective prosecution to not actually prosecute the government actors who broke the law, but simply to prosecute the one government actor who did expose it by technically violating a law of a different kind. Here again, I think that Edward Snowden, part of what made his acts heroic, and I would go so far as to say that I disagreed with them at the time, but there's a certain heroism in it at the same time, is that he took a risk that he didn't have to take in order to actually expose to the public what the public did not already know, and change that would not have happened in terms of delivering accountability to the government if he hadn't taken that risk. Part of what makes that risk admirable, just like Rosa Parks long ago, is the willingness to bear punishment he already has. That's also why I would ensure that he was a free man.
Wait. Did you just compare Rosa Parks to Edward Snowden?
No, I did not. But I did compare the aspect of their willingness to take a risk in order for, at the time, breaking a rule that at the time was punishable. Yes, some people have to take a risk. That's part of what drives progress in the country. And so it was progress of very different kinds. But yes, did Edward Snowden contribute to us making progress in delivering accountability to a part of the national security establishment that wasn't previously held accountable? Absolutely, he did.
What about Airman Teixeira?
I'd have to, like I said, I took a long time to get to my position on Edward Snowden, as well as Ross Ulbricht. I'm in the process of doing that one by one for a number of other cases that I'm in the process of studying, Hugh. But one of the things, you and I have said this since the first time we spoke, I'm not going to give you an answer off the cuff. Everything I'm with Ross Ulbricht, with Edward Snowden, with Julian Assange, that's after careful study and consideration that I've arrived at my position. But what I can tell you is we will have a list of day one pardons by the time I take office to say that we have one standard of justice in the United States that does not apply selectively based on your political beliefs or whether or not you're a member of a disfavored political class. And actually, one thing I have in today's Wall Street Journal, you'll note, Hugh, is my also commitment to repeal the Espionage Act in this country. This is one of the most un-American statutes ever passed, designed to stifle political dissent during World War I. So for me, it's not just about the pardons. I'm also going to actually roll back some of the toxic laws, like the Espionage Act, which, by the way, is being used to charge President Trump in the federal case. I've committed to actually repeal the Espionage Act and also to instruct the U.S. Department of Justice not to enforce it in the meantime. I lay out the history of that in today's Wall Street Journal editorial, and I think that's a big part of how I'm seeing this a little bit differently on the scales of history rather than just political tug of war as we might see in the present.
Yeah, my audience will know that I just disagree with everything you've said, but I am curious, are you familiar with Robert Hansen and John Walker? Are those cases familiar to you? They're old cases.
Yeah, so at a high level, I know the names, but I have not yet gone into depth into studying those.
Well, they're both
cases in the way
dead.
that I have some of the ones.
They're both dead, but one of the Walker conspirators is not, Jerry Whitworth, and he's still in jail, and I hope he dies there like the other people did, because traitors are traitors. But we disagree. We talked about the Triad the last time, and you went back and did your studying. Now that you're up to speed on some national security stuff, how do you value the Triad in terms of prioritizing money for each of the three parts of it?
I think it's important, and I think the prioritization is going to change over time, where we are today versus where we were before. But I think the redundancies in protecting ourselves against nuclear war is absolutely a priority today, as it was in the past. The threat presents itself a little bit differently today, though, Hugh. I think that Sino-Russian alliance, in a world with hypersonic missile capabilities, in a world with also super EMP capabilities, I think that threat presents itself in a different way than it did during the last Cold War, which is why I go back to saying, how do we go to address the root cause of the main military threat that we face? Pull apart Russia from China. It's the reverse of what Nixon did in 1972. I think we have an opportunity to do it. Nobody in either major political party is even talking about it today.
Okay, but that's a loop, Vivek. That's a loop. I'm focused on the three parts of the Triad, and we've got to figure out which one gets the most money and which one gets the least. Have you done that math yet?
I have not done the math of which one gets the most and which one gets the least, and I think that also those aren't going to be fixed over time, Hugh. I am biased towards actually thinking more heavily about the underfunding of the U.S. Navy and also the divest to invest program, which I think has actually resulted in underinvestment in our naval capabilities as well as our shipbuilding capabilities. But I think that that's going to actually be dynamic. It's going to change. It's not going to be the same answer today that it will even be 5 years from now. But I do think that it's important that we have those redundancies to protect the United States against nuclear threats.
I'm going to make my third pass at this and then move on. We've got the B-21, we've got Minutemen, which are old, and we've got the Columbia class. Which of those three do you think needs the most money the fastest?
Probably the Minutemen.
All right. Let me go to the 15 to 20 million people who are in the country without permission. They're here illegally. What would you do with them?
So look, I think that as humanely and respectfully as possible, we cannot grant amnesty. We have to return people to where they came from. But for people who have demonstrably made a commitment to this country to show themselves to otherwise be law-abiding citizens, but for their act of crossing illegally, to make contributions to this country, we need to have, for a subset of them, an opportunity for them to become legal immigrants to this country. But I think that because we stand on the rule of law, Hugh, because that's part of what it means to be an American, we have to stand by that commitment where there are immigrants who aim to come to this country legally, many of whom aren't able to get in. We have to follow one standard for everybody. Same thing I say at home, I say applies to our meritocratic immigration policy as well.
That sounds like
a lot of other Republicans.
I always say regularization, not amnesty, meaning you can stay if you're a good law-abiding person, but if you're not, you're gone. But 15 to 20 million people, we can't do case-by-case adjudications, can we?
I think that's the only standard we have to apply, Hugh, is that if you're in this country illegally, I stand by it that you have to go and be returned to whichever country you came from, but be given an opportunity to re-enter the country on the same terms that anybody else who's looking to enter the country can come in. So I favor merit-based immigration.
You're a tech guy. I want to close with the FTC lawsuit against Amazon. I always tell people I own Amazon, so I've got a conflict. I work for the Washington Post. Bezos owns the Washington Post. I think the FTC thing is the stupidest thing I've seen our government do in a long time. What did you think about it?
So look, I think that they're effectively throwing spaghetti against a wall here. I've been critical of Amazon in a lot of different contexts. But again, I do think that this is the use of a particular mode of expressing frustration against a company and it's sort of political virtue signaling, really, to the base of the Democratic Party, rather than something that's actually grounded on standards that are evenly applied to other companies. I think that much is clear here.
Ambassador O'Brien always tells me if we lose our tech edge to China, we're screwed, and we have to approach our big tech company issues with that in mind. Do you agree with him on that?
I agree in spirit. I do think that can be a lazy sort of argument to allow for a lot of corporate welfare to technology companies here in the United States, who actually are protected from competition, including from upstarts, in the name of arguments like the one that we've made there. So I think a lot of what I see, for example, even with the rising AI policies that are being lobbied for by the leading AI producers of AI protocols, is another example of usually large companies making these arguments for combinations of regulation and corporate welfare. And one of the popular arguments you frequently hear is competitiveness with China. I think there's truth to it, but we got to be careful not to fall for that, which is really just an argument for crony capitalism and corporate welfare of different kinds.
All right, Vivek, I'm out of time. I want to make sure people know it's Vivek.com, right? If they want to make a contribution, Vivek.com.
It's Vivek2024.com, Vivek 2024.com.
Are you over 40,000?
We're over 50,000, so we're in good shape.
So you're going to be on the debate stage. What do you think the format should be?
I think the format should be everybody's given equal time. I think there should be an opportunity for candidates to be able to address each other directly. I think the American people don't want to see and don't deserve to see a staged one-by-one serial speeches. I think we need to take the gloves off, have at it, push each other on our respective policy differences. That's going to make the Republican Party stronger. I think that's going to make the nation stronger.
Chris
I'll be
Christie
ready for
is
whatever
coming up.
format they put up.
What do you want me to ask Chris Christie?
You know, I'll ask Chris Christie. I'm actually, here's what I would say is one of his criticisms of President Trump, he's been very critical, is vengeance and grievance. We got to let it go and move past that. I'd ask him if that applies 360 degrees around the board, whether that's personal vengeance or grievance, whatever direction. My path is how do we move forward as a country? And the question for him that I'd have, respectfully, and I'd ask him this on the debate stage as well, is how do you avoid personal tug of war? Let's get beyond the personal tug of war and mudslinging in one direction or another and ask ourselves, what do we actually stand for as a movement? Forget the who. What do we stand for? Why do we stand for it? What's our vision of what it means to be an American? How do we start running to something? That's what
I will ask him that right after the break. Vivek, please keep coming back. Remember, when you've got that empty seat at the shoe, journalists are allowed to accompany you if they're doing so to observe you watching an Ohio State game. Just saying. By the way, last question. Ryan Day or Urban Meyer? Who's the better coach?
You know, I would say, I mean, depends on who you like better versus the better coach, but Urban Meyer was a pretty darn good coach. So I'll leave it at that. In his
the controversy follows Vivek wherever he goes. Thank you, Vivek. Have a great day.
Thank you, Hugh.
Welcome back, America. Elton John gave a farewell concert in England last night, so I just thought I'd play some Elton John today. Josh Kraushaar must be an Elton John fan. Good morning, Josh. How are you?
Good morning. I'm a fan of 70s classic rock in general, so
Yes.
I think Elton John qualifies.
Absolutely. Josh, the Faith and Freedom Forum this weekend. Everybody was there. Any winners, any losers, any takeaways by you who follow 2024 as well as anybody?
Well, look, I think the story was the final speech. Former President Trump getting a pretty warm reception from the socially conservative crowd, and that is combined with the new NBC poll over the weekend showing even post federal indictment, Trump has expanded his lead over Ron DeSantis in the Republican primary. And look, I think the Faith and Freedom the conference there this past week is a good bellwether of the socially conservative Republican base. And there's a lot of speculation over the last few months that evangelical voters, because of Trump's less doctrinaire position on kind of these 6-week bans or a federal abortion ban, that he may be losing some support with social conservatives. That's not the case. I don't think that was the case in the conference. It's not the case in the latest Republican primary polling. And look, I still think we're in the same position we were last time we talked, where Trump is in a solid front runner position to once again win the Republican nomination, and he's doing it largely again with support from social conservatives.
Josh, I've got Vivek Ramaswamy and Chris Christie coming up next hour for long interviews. How are they faring? Are they going to make the debate stage, do you think?
Well, let's start with Chris Christie. His candidacy is kind of interesting because he's sort of consolidating the anti-Trump vote. It's not going to be enough to win the nomination, but you can see in some of the polls out of New Hampshire, especially, where he's moved into, I think, third place in 2 New Hampshire polls, and he's right on Ron DeSantis' heels. And if Trump ends up being as dominant as he looks right now within the Republican Party, Christie could end up actually being sort of the rival figure, at least in a state like New Hampshire. He's not going to win the nomination consolidating anti-Trump voters, but he could get to 20-25% and be a factor and really, it should help him at least in the polling get on the debate stage. He'll need more donors. He'll need to get, I think, 40,000 donors by the time of the August debate. But I think he's on a good trajectory to get there. I think Ramaswamy, too. It's hard to see him being left off the stage, given his standing in the polls. He's in the mid-single digits in a lot of polls, and I think he's gotten enough grassroots support that he also should be able to cross that donation threshold.
Now, when I talk about Vivek, everyone thinks ESG and social issues. I'm talking about national security issues as well this time. Does he need to broaden his rhetoric to other issues, or can he stay focused like a laser on ESG and gender dysphoria and things like that?
Well, we actually had an interview with him in Jewish Insider last week where he kind of dabbled a little bit more on Ukraine and sounds as anti-Ukraine as I've heard from any Republican candidate, including Donald Trump. He kind of invoked some negative hits against Zelensky in this interview we did with him. So, I think he's dabbled in foreign policy, trying to play to the sort of the NatCon folks or sort of the faction of kind of anti-Ukraine Republicans. Again, I don't think it's enough to get him the nomination or even get him a whole lot more support, but he's gotten into the zeitgeist of this faction of the party that sort of combines anti-woke with a very retrograde kind of throwback foreign policy.
How big do you think that is, that part of the Republican Party primary electorate?
Well, first of all, I don't think many Republicans focus on foreign policy as much as we talk about it, as important as it is and as much as we talk about it. I'd say about maybe 10-15% of the Republican Party is very critical of Zelensky, critical of Ukraine, kind of in that space in the party.
You think it's that big, 10 to 15%?
You look the different variations of it, but you just look in the Senate, you see folks like Vance, you see folks like there's certain Republican senators that have run on that kind of message. Again, it varies. I don't think it goes as far as Ramaswamy has suggested in his own rhetoric. But, there is sort of room for that space in the party, much more so right now. And I never would have imagined it, Hugh. The Republican Party has always been sort of the hawkish national security party, and the Democrats have generally been very, dovish on those issues. You do have this faction more in the Republican Party right now than you do. You do have the progressive wing in the Democratic Party, but right now you have the folks like Ramaswamy who are very vocal and outspoken about these issues.
I've got a new Washington Post column up right now, Josh. It's on the landing page with a half dozen potential vice presidential nominees. I know you haven't read it yet. It just went up. What do you think is going to be the most important thing for any of these nominees to have in a vice presidential candidate on the ticket?
Well, let's if Trump is the nominee, which is an open question, but if he's the nominee, I think the big factor would be, does he want someone to amplify his views, amplify MAGA, or does he want someone in the vein of Mike Pence back in 2016, who would be a complement, to be a diplomat to the less enthusiastic Trump supporters? So, in that latter category, I think a Tim Scott is going to get a lot of attention. I think someone who has not really criticized Trump that aggressively, has very he's doing quite well, or he's making a name for himself in this primary campaign. We'll see what he does in the end. I think he would make a lot of sense. I think on the MAGA category, there are a lot of folks. Carrie Lake gets mentioned a lot. I don't think she has a lot of much of a political resume, and not many wins.
She's not on my list. You're going to have to go look at my list. I look forward to hearing what Josh thinks of my list. The Great Mentioner is already at work. Josh and I are part of the Great Mentioner, meaning that we talk about politics, and collectively the Great Mentioner comes up with a list. Josh Kraushaar on Twitter, Jewish Insider, Axios, one of the best. Go and follow him.